the classic Gothic horror monsters, Bram Stoker's Count Dracula is arguably the one with the strongest legacy. While not the origin of the vampire figure, Dracula has become a mainstay in horror for generations, and the effect of his novel is obvious in almost every piece of vampire storytelling since. In New Year of 2020, BBC One and Netflix released Dracula, a 3-episode series written by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, the writers behind one of my favorite shows of all time, Sherlock. Being both a fan of the titular creature and the team that was behind the show, I was very excited to see what they would produce. In preparation for the release, I reread the original novel, which stands as one of my favorite books of all time. When I watched the first 2 episodes, I had a pretty good time. The show was appropriately dark and gory, Claes Bang was providing a different, yet still chilling performance as Count Dracula. The writing was clever, if a bit over-reliant on puns.
Well, you do look rather drained.
I'm undead, I'm not unreasonable.
The show had some pretty major deviations from the book, but they were changes I was generally okay with, as they provided a different perspective on the character. The show had Dracula as more of a protagonist than the external force he was in the book, and it deconstructed the vampire mythos associated with him.
I don't know, none of the vampire legends make sense, and yet somehow they are proving to be true. He can't enter a home without being invited. Why not? The light of the day would burn him to death. Why? He's terrified of the cross, and yet he's no believer.
I was interested to see where the show would go from there. And then the 3rd episode happened, and the show completely derailed for me. Without spoiling anything, the way the show handled its 3rd episode, as well as the explanations for the vampire mythos it has, I thought were very disappointing. After watching it, I realized that while I'd seen many versions of the vampire that were considered good films, I'd never seen any version that really adapted the novel's themes and ideas. I decided to look into it. I watched as many of the classic adaptations as I could find. Nosferatu, Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman, TV movies, etc. How was it that none of these classic films adapted the original source material's core concepts? And so, I looked a bit further, and after a lot of research, I realized it would be nearly impossible for a faithful adaptation of the original Dracula to succeed. And in this video essay, I'm going to tell you why. To look into why Dracula can't work on screen, let's look at the core themes of the original novel. Bram Stoker's Dracula doesn't have a central main character. Instead, it is a recollection of diary entries, newspaper clippings, doctor's logs, and medical notes that combine together to tell the story. It's essentially a literary version of a found footage movie a la Paranormal Activity. The novel has more of a suspenseful tone than real gory horror. Dracula functions less as a physical antagonist and more as a presence. He appears rarely, and apart from the first few chapters at his castle, he barely talks. It's almost more a psychological threat, rather than a physical one. The novel constantly refers to Dracula as the devil incarnate, a being of pure evil, a beast. Dracula isn't a character, he is the manifestation of evil and corruption. The novel preys on the fear of the unknown and the blindness of modernity. The monster is a foreign creature with mysterious ways that defies explanation to the modern minds of the British protagonists, many of which are scientists or proclaimers of modern advancements. Mina, for example, is an avid fan of the typewriter, and she is the one who allegedly types over all the diary entries and so forth into one document, the novel itself. Dr. Seward constantly proclaims the advancements of modern medicine and the study of psychological disorders such as Renfield's. All of the characters are constantly stumped by what ails Lucy Westenra as she loses blood, unable to find an explanation as they cannot look beyond their modern mindsets.
I am at a loss, I admit.
It is only Van Helsing, an open-minded scientist and a foreigner himself, who immediately realizes that Dracula is a vampire. He constantly proclaims that they must study all they can, and that includes ancient myths and legends. He works not only to understand modern Western methods, but also those that the modern West dismisses. The main fear of the novel comes from the uncertainty of what Dracula is, what he can do, what he plans. And that is why he will never be adapted well to screen. I mentioned before that Dracula is an icon of horror culture. He's been adapted to screen more than any other horror character in history, and stands among the top 10 adapted literary characters as a whole. And that's precisely why the original novel's core themes will never work on film. Everyone knows Dracula, everyone knows what he does, how he does it, and how to beat him. The vampire mythos is far too common knowledge for a traditional Dracula film to work, at least in the way it was intended. The fear from the novel is the fear of the unknown, but we know Dracula. A traditional adaptation would make the character seem boring or cliché. There's no mystery to what Dracula can do or what his MO is. We already know. Now that's not to say there can't be good Dracula films. I love many of the classic takes. The silent chills of Nosferatu, the theatricality of Lugosi, the campiness of Hammer horror, the wild insanity of Ford Coppola. It's just that the character as originally made and the novel as originally written can no longer work in the same way. That's why the new Dracula is more of a deconstruction of the character. Instead of spending time in fear of what he can do, the show aims to explain why he does it, decipher why Dracula is averse to the cross, why he can't walk in the sun, and so on. This concept works as a response to Dracula's previous adaptations. It melds elements of previous incarnations into something wholly new. For example, Dracula's castle is the same one used for Nosferatu. Many shots and designs pay homage to previous interpretations, especially the Hammer horror iterations. On paper and its initial execution, I think the show is rather good. The atmosphere is good, the gore is good, the dialogue has that fun Sherlock snappiness to it.
Mr. Harker, I intend no impertinence, but why are you still alive?
It works for me. Claes Bang is a different but still recognizable Dracula, most of the cast is doing a very good job, and the reinterpretations of characters generally work for me. The only problem is the final episode and ultimately reveal of the questions the show poses, which are simply too weak. The show builds up a mystery that it doesn't have enough of an answer for. Or at least, the show doesn't establish a proper payoff scene for these mysteries. I still recommend watching Dracula to any fan of the vampire or vampire media in general. It goes back to the roots of the character and attempts to add a different spin on the character while still maintaining the core of what makes it work. Dracula is quite possibly the most popular horror monster of all time. Much like classic superheroes, he is a character that will be reinterpreted for years to come. Some will be better, some will be worse, but the character will always stick with us, if only for that shiver down our spine. I'm sad that a faithful adaptation will probably never work for our modern sensibilities, but I will never complain about seeing him on screen. Except Dracula Untold, that film sucks. Thanks for watching everyone, hope you liked this video. Feel free to check out something else on my channel, or discussing your favorite adaptation of Dracula in the comments. I'm partial to Gary Oldman myself, regardless of the hairdo. I do have social media, it's linked in my profile, so you can definitely talk to me there. I love hearing what you have to say. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.